Welcome to the latest edition of the Mind-Gut Conversation. Today, I had the pleasure to talk to Dr. Stephen Tan, internist, traditional Chinese medicine expert, and startup entrepreneur, as well as the force behind the new app, eat.selectivor.com. Welcome to the show, Steve.
Thanks so much, Emran. It's a pleasure to be here.
I would like to start this conversation with asking you, what is Selectivor app and how does it work?
Yeah, the whole idea behind the Selectivor app is to address this growing trend that we're seeing where everyone is now becoming selective about what they eat, which is the reason behind us naming it Selectivor. So studies now show that around the world, actually 2 in 3 people now maintain at least one dietary restriction. The problem is that even though most of us have at least one dietary restriction, we're not all keeping the same restriction. And so it's getting harder for us to continue to eat our way, particularly when everyone is competing to have their own eating wishes met. So to solve this problem of helping people understand what they can eat and to help engage and maintain sort of the social fabric of group dining, we created this AI-driven digital tool. And what this does is it essentially helps all of us to always eat our way. And it is particularly helpful in 2 broad cases. The first is when we're trying to figure out, as we navigate the complicated food world, what we can eat. So imagine if you were just recently diagnosed by your physician with a medical condition and you need to eat certain foods, or you're diagnosed with a food allergy, or maybe you're just trying to check out a ketogenic diet because you feel it might be healthy. It's hard to know what exactly these diets mean in a very granular way. And most folks, most physicians and healthcare providers really don't have the time to go into that. So this is a platform that quickly allows people, individuals, to know what they can eat. The second broad case in which it can help is when you're not in charge of making that food decision. For example, many people really aren't the primary food preparer in their household, or even the primary food purchaser. And then there are always those social instances where we're invited to various social functions, luncheons, dinners, celebrations, where again, at that point, when you're not in charge of those food decisions and you are a selective eater, you need a way to be able to communicate your eating wishes and needs to others. And so that was the whole idea behind a lot of the social features around Selectivor, so that again, no matter where you are, whether it's by yourself or with others, you know what you can eat and others know what you can eat, so you can always maintain your eating wish integrity.
Yeah, this is really fascinating. And I should preface before we go on our conversation, Dr. Tan is has a very innovative mind. I had that personal experience already when both of us were at UCLA and worked together on a review article on the convergence of traditional Chinese medicine with some of the most innovative scientific discoveries and the whole systems biological view of body and mind. So it doesn't surprise me that this very innovative tool, Selectivor, is again addressing a topic that most other people would not have thought about. Well, who do you think should use it, or what's your target audience?
Yeah, I mean, there's, in terms of the general population usage, it really is particularly, I think, useful for people who are recently diagnosed with something, a condition where food interventions will make an impact. And more, what we're seeing in the medical world, whether it's in clinical medicine or in the research spaces, we are seeing that food does impact wellness outcomes. So this is something that, Dr. Moms have known, for millennia, but now we're getting that message through in terms of the clinical practice of medicine. We're having a lot of, almost for every specialty condition, explorations in terms of the impact of dietary interventions in wellness. So number one, I think people who are on a new diet or newly diagnosed or trying to start a different way of eating and trying to learn what that diet requires. And so the idea with Selectivor is you can know exactly which foods you should eat and which foods you should avoid. The second group of people that would benefit are people that live with or interact frequently with people who are selective eaters, because you need to know what the needs and wishes of the folks that you're interacting and socializing through food with. So those would be the two broad categories. And given the statistics where we're seeing, again, 2 out of 3 people worldwide with at least one food restriction, that probably encompasses the vast majority of people out there who can benefit in some way, from knowing this information about how people wish to eat.
I personally have always struggled with the idea. So personalization, precision medicine, these are, catchwords now in the healthcare environment. And in some ways it makes a lot of sense. On the other hand, I'm a little bit of a skeptic, because I ask myself, why do we need, for example, personalization of diets? We humans have evolved as omnivores that can fulfill their energy needs by eating just about anything that's available if we need to. And so why all of a sudden this realization that that everybody basically has to have their personalized diet?
Yeah, I think there are many different reasons and answers for that. I think the primary one is that in modern life is far different than where we began from an evolutionary perspective. We're no longer struggling with, at least in the modern world, I should say, we're no longer struggling with food scarcity. Whereas before modern agriculture, before modern farming techniques and livestock techniques, food procurement was a big issue. Malnourishment, undernourishment were the big challenges. Nowadays, you can walk into a Costco or any supermarket, and food scarcity is something that you don't think about. And so because we have a lot of options now, I think there's been a shift from eating what we can find to really choosing amongst many options. I often think about my dog, for instance. When I feed even my dog kibble, and if I give him some chicken, trying to get him to go back to the kibble is not something he would easily do. I've got to coax him to do that. So I think perhaps the simplest way of understanding that is we're blessed to live in modern times in our part of the world where we have food abundance, and as a result we can be pickier about what we can eat. There are a couple other health trends that have also I think played a role in this link between, I think, the consumer understanding of the link between food and health. And people have sort of explored whether foods may be impacting their wellness. So those are probably two very obvious drivers of this personalization trend that's going on in society right now.
Yeah, and this is also, as you know, it's reflected. So there's several companies that aim to personalize diet and to a certain degree also lifestyle based on, for example, gut microbial composition or molecules that these microbes produce. And I think sooner or later we'll be in a world where the patient comes to the physician and says, I've been tested with this and this device, and it indicates that I can only eat this particular diet. And as physicians, we're really ill prepared for this. I would say the majority of us, so speaking for myself, being a gastroenterologist, I don't think I had more than 1 hour of education in nutrition and dietary recommendations. So this is clearly a very new world. I would also say, in addition to what you said about why this is now an issue. On the one side, we have limited the diversity, for example, the genetic diversity of plant-based foods and animal-based foods that we eat. On the other hand, we have seen an explosion of different products with different preparations, different chemicals, different mixtures, that I think if you sort of compare this to what existed like 100 years ago in the supermarket, I don't know what the factor would be, 10-fold, 100-fold increase in the diversity of food. So the choice that people have to make is is much, much bigger than what it was in the past.
Yeah, I mean, when you explore kind of from a historical perspective, why now? Why has this become such a big problem now? I think you can really go back to perhaps three huge icebergs that have been slowly coming together and have now suddenly converged. And those three factors are, number one, changes that have occurred within the food industry over the last few decades. And then number two, changes that have occurred in terms of societal health issues. And the third is just this increase in awareness and communication around food. So looking back at the food industry, you had alluded to some of these, Emran, and I think you're absolutely right. When over the last few decades, the food industry has really introduced things such as genetically modified crops. They've also industrialized food manufacturing and livestock raising. These are things that many thought leaders have written about, like Michael Pollan and such. And as a result, we've been able to bump our food productivity, but as you said, maybe perhaps limited the genetic variety of the foods that we're eating. As a backlash, we're now seeing a rise in the organic food industry and more clean food industry. So that has been happening at the same time as in the healthcare environment of society, we're seeing our population starting to gray. And as we age, we start to have more health issues. And so the number of people that are looking to food as a solution to try to stay healthy and well, or to address active medical conditions has gone up. We're dealing in the Western world, United States included, with this obesity epidemic. So that's been another big factor. And also this unusual rise in food allergies and sensitivities, where we're seeing now something on the order of 15 million Americans, 1 in 13 children, that's 2 in every classroom, now with some sort of food allergy. And these numbers have been climbing, like 50% of childhood food allergies over the last decade, a 50% growth in the number of diagnoses. So that's been happening in the health world. And then finally, with technology and communication and media, everyone is talking about food, and food information is much more readily available. And that dialogue and exchange of information and individual experience with food and health is now out there. We've got the Food Network. Everyone wants to be a celebrity chef. Everyone's sharing photographs on Instagram of food. So it's this convergence of all three that have now made us all much more aware of not only what's happening in the food environment, but also the impact of food and wellness and all the different choices that are available. So everyone's trying different things to I think, optimize how they feel. And it's a very interesting frustration that you brought up as a physician. I've shared it, throughout my entire career in terms of how little doctors have been leading this movement. We're really just trying to catch up and understand what's going on and guide our patients as to what is the right way. So, yeah, I think it's a very interesting time in this phenomenon right now.
Yeah, I want to come back to the topic of allergies and sensitivities, because that's something obviously very relevant to this whole development.
Right.
But let me ask you this question. It's a little bit the continuation of what we talked about earlier. Could one reason be that most people today eat primarily to fulfill their hedonic needs and their emotional worries, satisfy, calm their emotional worries, rather than their metabolic needs? So what we have evolved as humans, the main thing initially was survival, getting enough food. That still pertains to a large portion of the human population around the world. But is what we're seeing today, is this that the dominant factors that really decide what we would like to eat and what we are afraid and are avoiding has nothing to do anymore with the sort of the homeostatic system of eating regulation, but it's all basically in our higher levels of our brain. So this includes, some people eat primarily for pleasure, others eat primarily for health, Others restrict their eating because of worries and anxieties. And all this seems to be superseding really the basic traditional function of eating, which was satisfy your homeostatic needs. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, I think all of those for different subsets of people who are selective eaters might resonate with different subgroups out there. But yeah, it's a very interesting situation in modern times where we're no longer having to fight for the food, right? We now have so many options out there that now it's very interesting where people are going from this place of options. Where you can have, it's this incredible luxury, perhaps in the history of mankind, to be able to be in this place where we can now pick and choose, where we're not being forced to eat whatever is available, foraging and fighting for mere survival. Now we can go after loftier aims, such as, you know, expressing our philosophical outlook through diet, expressing or practicing religious beliefs through diet. And from the health perspective, really trying to now, I think for people who have symptoms and who find that they don't feel well, to explore food as a possible avenue for feeling better. And for those that are really interested in more prevention and wellness, those that don't really suffer from that, exploring food as another tool that they can use to promote longevity and wellness and health. So we really are, you know, in a very, very luxurious place where we can actually explore these almost higher interactions with food. Whereas back in the day, you know, we really, it was a must-have. We needed to find it. It was a scarce resource.
Yeah, absolutely. So this is a little bit related to this. So everybody now feels, you know, they have to have their own diets for their optimal well-being.
Yeah.
But how do you reconcile the fact that predominantly plant-based diets seem to be, at least for the majority of studies, optimal for the health of people in most studies and epidemiological surveys, as well as for prevention of chronic diseases, with this trend for personalized diets? So one extreme for that, I would say, is there's clearly a lot of voices out there that promote a ketogenic diet. And, you know, I'm always fascinated by talking to people about this, even colleagues with a somewhat scientific mind, that they think they feel better on a ketogenic diet. They've lost their brain fog. They can concentrate better. But the scientific data from trials and epidemiology really all go in one direction, sort of not personalized, but this generalized, basic, optimal diet.
Yeah, you know, as you said, there are different experts will disagree, right? There are going to be specific proponents of certain types, whether it's a high protein or a low carbohydrate or a high carbohydrate diet. These pendulums have kind of swung back and forth over the last several decades. I think part of this sort of this dissonance between why plant-based diets, as we're seeing, and I agree with you, the trend suggests, the evidence suggests that that is perhaps a more healthy way to eat globally, although perhaps certain segments of the population may do better, you know, genetically on say a higher protein diet. I'm not sure, but I think part of that really goes to changes in the food industry. If you think about it, I think over the last few decades, we've really gotten towards very high processed grains of diet. Predominantly, this was, I think, in response actually to USDA recommendations and their food pyramid that was really restricting fats or sort of demonizing fats. And now we're learning that there are differences between good and bad fats. And so as a result, we really moved towards a high carbohydrate, especially refined carbohydrate diet for the last few decades. And that probably reduced the whole grains, the vegetables and fruit intake in societal eating, at least in the Western world. Now, I think people have gotten so accustomed to the pleasure of eating these refined foods and fattier meats and full fat dairies, these richer, sweeter foods, even salty foods, that it's harder now to walk people away from what would be a more natural, cleaner diet, less processed diet, which is what we're seeing in things such as the Mediterranean and all of these more plant-based traditional diets. So it may just be that we went to the other extreme in our dietary patterns over the last few decades for many different reasons. And now really just trying to walk back to more of a balanced way of eating that you see in many traditional cultures and societies is as you said, as far as the movement of the evidence is going, showing that that is perhaps the better way to eat compared with that standard American diet that we've been so used to.
This trend towards this selective eating or personalization of food and diet, it's certainly a phenomenon that is more prevalent in certain parts of the US, most likely, you know, the big metropolitan centers on the East and West Coast. Whereas I would say in the center of the country, in the Midwest, there's you know, traditionally a very different attitude towards food. And I haven't seen any surveys about this. You know, if there's also a trend now in these other areas of the United States that towards selective eating, or if it's still, you know, the culturally preferred way of having the traditional big steak, potatoes, and sugary foods. So do you think we're seeing a culturally driven divide in the, I mean, there's so many other divides, but do you think this also affects the food intake, choices of food?
Absolutely. I think part of it is perhaps access to certain foods. You know, I think even within the metropolitan coasts, you see certain segments, inner cities, underserved communities where they have less access to fresh produce, and so their fresh produce intake isn't as high. Perhaps in less, you know, less, not in the coast, I should say, where this sort of diversity of eating is more common, there isn't that discussion, that cross communication about the different ways that one can eat, and perhaps that is why selective eating is not perhaps as common there. Although I would argue that there is a different type of selective eating in those parts of the country, right? I mean, you know, we're all selective. One dimension of being selective are just foods you simply don't like to eat, or foods that you just refuse to eat. And so those that really don't eat a lot of fresh produce, fruits and vegetables, that is a selective way of eating. What's really interesting, that when I was doing a lot of the research in building Selectivor and looking at sort of global trends, I initially thought that we would find the highest number of selective eaters in the Western world. I assumed that, you know, the United States would be like 80% selective eaters, but actually the highest rates of people who maintain at least one dietary restriction are, number one, the Middle East, where data shows that about 70 to 80% of the population in the Middle East maintain at least one restriction. And the second is the Pacific Asian region. US rates are actually about half. And these don't include things such as, again, just based on taste. These are people for various reasons. I think in the Middle East, it's probably driven by a lot of cultural and religious eating patterns, such as halal and kosher, these sort of other motivations behind being selective eaters. But yeah, I think social influences have a lot to do with it, peer influences, and then also communication of information. And then finally, availability.
Mm. Another factor that you know, is likely to contribute to this, maybe you know, you could say that much of this phenomenon is purely consumerism or consumer-driven, or do you think there's other players like big agriculture, food companies, and healthcare exerting influence on consumer behavior?
Yeah, I think it's really hard. Ultimately, it's consumers that make the final decision as to what they will put in their bodies. But I think I really feel badly for the consumer trying to sort through all this information. You get so many mixed signals from so many people that purport to be experts in the field. I mean, this is where we get this crazy kind of impossible situation where you've got experts saying that the low carbohydrate diets are the way to go. And then on the other side, experts saying that, low fat diets are the way to go. And it's really hard to reconcile and make decisions as to what is right for me as an individual. And so part of the result of that is, I think, different people sort of, follow a certain or gravitate towards a certain point of view, a certain thinking or a certain thought leader, and are experimenting and seeing, what is making me feel better. But yeah, there are a lot of, ultimately I would say it is sort of a consumer driven phenomenon simply because the consumer is the final decision maker, but there are so many influences on these consumers, be it from food manufacturers with their marketing of what is healthy, low this, low that, multiple additives to try to boost up nutritional values and then marketing that as heart healthy or this healthy or that healthy. Lots of people coming in from the health industry, wellness industry, with different points of view that will argue their case and make their case to the consumers. And then all the different things that are going on in sort of the food manufacturing, the agriculture, livestock industries as well, such as, again, genetically modified organisms using pesticides, using fertilization techniques that all impact the consumer in the end.
It's really fascinating when you think about it. I mean, so diet is clearly one of the major factors that determines our health and our risk for chronic diseases. And you would think that something like diet would be evidence-based recommendations, evidence and science-based. But what we're seeing is really the opposite, that completely different recommendations come from many different MDs. I mean, once you're sort of a celebrity, best-selling, New York Times best-selling writer, people will follow this just because, not because it's science-based, evidence-based, but because they think if such a prominent person recommends this, this must be the truth. And quite honestly, I think the healthcare system and physicians have really played overall a minor role in this. Do you agree with this?
Well, I think we played perhaps a passive role because it's something that we ourselves weren't well educated and trained to do. So it's an area where a lot of doctors don't feel comfortable really engaging in that conversation and giving counsel and advice to their patients. I'm hoping that that shift is changing as patients, as consumers of healthcare are now pushing that envelope and asking these questions of their doctors. But yeah, it's a challenge. As you know, doctors are under a lot of pressures, more responsibilities than ever before, that to take the time and be able to counsel and go through food lists is not something that I think is within their schedule to do. What I think is very interesting, and it reminds me, Emran, of the work that we did years ago in looking at irritable bowel. I think in terms of understanding why there's such a diversity of ways of eating and why we're seeing certain people respond and being advocates of one type of diet and then other people equally passionate about another way of eating, is realistically there's probably different subsets of our population, each of whom is probably genetically, biologically determined to respond better to one way of eating. I don't think that perhaps a one-size-fits-all approach to diet works well for everyone across the board on a population basis. And this is where it's very interesting, this the developments in gut biome research, and I'm curious to hear your thoughts on where you think that might be going in terms of perhaps either giving us better, maybe data-driven decision-making in response to helping people understand which diets or select more wisely which diets or food choices might be better for them. We need some sort of, hopefully we can find some sort of data-driven way to more personalize this in an accurate way. Have any thoughts on that? It's a dynamic field now.
Yeah, I mean, I can throw in my own opinion on this. I mean, clearly, of all the things that the microbiome has been implicated in now, from psychiatric disease to metabolic disease, I think the one major general benefit that is coming out of this awareness and the increased research into the microbiome and health really has to do with this concept that we don't all have, we vary pretty dramatically, even between individuals, in terms of the makeup, the composition of our gut microbiomes, and to a much bigger degree than we do genetically. So you would think that these efforts that are going on now, pretty intense efforts by companies like Biome or uBiome or Day2, that are all on the search for individual fingerprints of the microbiome, either the composition or their function, would be the best way to recommend then a specific diet, be it that you're healthy or be it that you're have metabolic syndrome or type 2 diabetes, that not everybody would get the same recommendation. And I think this is very exciting. I mean, there's this kind of research is being performed on tens of thousands of people by these companies now. And I think the final word is not out yet on it, but certainly the trends suggest that this may be the way to go for the future. And again, I find it interesting, the healthcare system is lagging way behind those kind of commercial approaches that are measuring with very innovative ways, with wearable devices, stool assessments, assessments of your blood metabolomes just from a finger prick. All this can be done and assessed without the patient or the individual able to have to come into a hospital setting or to their physician.
Yeah.
So I think we're close to a situation where these kind of opinion-based recommendations, what diet is good for you, may really become or develop a scientific footing that is uncontested and that will ultimately resolve the current situation, which is very confusing to the consumer. I mean, it's really, I'm not sure how a non-medically educated consumer can really make a rational decision of what's best for them.
I would say it's even hard as a physician in the field to keep up with all the new developments and all the different opinions that are coming out all the time. We see conflicting studies, all the time. And so especially in a field as nutrition and food, a lot of these studies tend to be, a little softer around the edges. So it's harder to get that that very clear, definitive study. There's so many factors that go into overall wellness and other than just the foods that we eat. So it would be interesting to see these emerging biological markers, hopefully shedding some light and giving us some guidance on what perhaps is the best way forward. I think right now the situation is it's really fallen on the shoulders of the individuals, of the consumers, of the patients. And I think what we're seeing in terms of their behavior in selective eating is this is how they're trying to figure it out themselves, because there's so much information there. You see people changing diets all the time. I'm going to try, keto one day, then I'm going to try, Mediterranean, then I'm going to see whether I'm getting rid of dairy makes me feel better, and all the different elimination strategies. And I think this is just, if you will, the consumer trying to take charge in this environment where they're not getting any definitive, authoritative voice that is universally accepted.
So it seems that the Selectivor app, is a very useful approach to deal with the situation. You say on your website that the app is powered by a physician-curated database of nearly 80 diet templates and 600 individual foods, and it provides trustworthy information on all these different diets. Is this fairly unique, or are you guys the only app that provides this extensive information?
Well, I think we're actually the most robust, especially among the few that are physician curated, created, and advised. So we have all physician advisory panel, where those numbers are actually quite, a little dated. We have now over 100 diets, half of which are diseases, are specialty condition based. Our database is now beyond 1,000 foods. We haven't launched, but we're ready to launch an additional 300 food additives that are also in our database. So it continues to grow. There are many different tools out there that help people figure out what they should eat for any specific condition. What I love about Selectivor and why we built it this way was because watching patients go through their journey and the challenges that they were facing and trying to stay on the diet. Number one, it was hard for them to find trustworthy information about what they could eat. So, you know, when the evidence was available, we really went to the original resource or studies that were published in the literature, but also to succeed in how you're eating, you need to be supported in all the eating environments, not just your own decision-making, but because food is so social, it was so critical that individuals not only know what they should eat, but the people around them also know so they can be supported. So I think these are a few unique offerings on Selectivor that I'm hoping will be a solution that will finally break through, you know, the noise and really help patients achieve, or help people really achieve the goals that they want to achieve. What's very interesting, the process of really trying to vet what ultimately was hosted for different conditions is sort of what we struggled with what you had mentioned, Emran, before, where even experts within the same field, subspecialists within the same field, often disagree of what is the perfect diet. So, you know, we had to make these editorial decisions to try to find, you know, sort of the most reasonable middle ground, despite the various opinions out there. And, you know, hopefully we can have, I think we want to provide clarity for users, but we as editors and curators of this information would love more clear signals ourselves, more data, more information, so that we can pass that along to, you know, to the average person who's trying to sort through all this themselves.
Well, thank you, Stephen, for this really informative and fascinating conversation. I can only recommend to anybody who has an issue with food sensitivities or doesn't know exactly which dietary direction they should follow, to go to the Selectivor website, eat.selectivor.com, and inform themselves. I personally, from my own personal experience, having worked with Steve, I could say he's probably one of the most authoritative and trustworthy sources for this information. Thank you very much for the time you took to do this interview.
Thanks so much, Emran. It was a pleasure.